Strange Shadows, a Clark Ashton Smith podcast. Tell me many tales, O benign maleficent demon, but tell me none that I have ever heard or have even dreamt of, otherwise than obscurely or infrequently. Nay, tell me not of anything that lies between the bournes of time or the limits of space, for I am a little weary of all recorded years and charted lands, and the isles that are westward of Cathay and the sunset realms of Ind are not remote enough to be made the abiding place of my conceptions, and Atlantis is over new for my thoughts to sojourn there, and Mu itself has gazed upon the sun in aeons that are too recent.
Welcome to Strange Shadows and the first season and first episode of a new fortnightly Clark Ashton Smith podcast. The voice you just heard was Shelley de Cruz reading the opening lines of To a Demon. I'm one of your hosts, Rob Poyton.
And I'm Tim Mendees. Over the next coming months, we'll be reading through Clark Ashton Smith's weird fiction in chronological order. There's over 100 stories, isn't there? So we've got plenty to cover.
Oh, yes.
We've no shortage of material. We'll also talk about his life and invite some guests in to share their knowledge and views on one of weird fiction's finest.
Indeed. What we thought we'd do is this first episode, just to start things off, we'd introduce ourselves, give a little bit of background on us, tell you a little bit about how the podcast is going to work, how it's set up, and we'll also give a brief overview of Clark Ashton Smith. We're not going to go too deeply into his bio here because we're going to be covering that as we go along.
Yeah.
We'll also mention why we think he deserves his own dedicated podcast.
Yeah, because there's been a few over the years, hasn't there? There's been a few, and such as the excellent Double Shadow.
Yeah.
But as far as we know at the minute, there's no other dedicated podcast to Clark Ashton Smith, which is a bit of a shame, really.
Yeah.
So yeah, to our knowledge, we'll be the only one at the moment. But if anybody does know of any other Clark Ashton Smith podcasts, feel free to let us know, because the more Clark Ashton Smith in the world is always to the better, isn't it? You know,
Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So yeah, let's start off. So yeah, if you want to tell us who you are and how you got into Clark Ashton Smith, sir.
So I'm Robert Poyton. I'm a writer, musician, and my other day job is teaching martial arts. I guess I got into weird fiction probably I was always an avid reader as a kid and read The Hobbit and Narnia and all those things. Then I think I must have been about 11 or 12 and my dad brought home a Conan paperback. I think it's one of the Sphere 70s paperbacks.
Nice.
And about the same time we had the Marvel comics as well. So I was already into Spider-Man and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And then the Barry Windsor Smith sort of Conan run came out. So those two kind of coincided. Then from there, I always remember seeing on the back of the Conan paperbacks, there were quotes from this H.P. Lovecraft guy. And I think I saw a book by him in the local library. And that's how that started.
Yes.
And then from there, of course, on the back of the Lovecraft paperbacks, you see mentions of Clark Ashton Smith. Or on Clark Ashton Smith's books, there's the quote from Lovecraft. So, you know.
Yeah.
So that was how I got into that. And as far as these days goes, I set up Innsmouth Gold probably about 8 years ago now. I had a music project on the go. I decided to do a collection of soundscapes based around Lovecraft stories. And I thought, how do I put this out?
Yeah.
So I set up Innsmouth Gold as a kind of, I suppose, a publisher or an outlet, really, for my music. And then started doing a bit of writing as well. So I've got quite a few books out now, and of course some anthologies as well, which you've been good enough to grace with your talents.
The dubious talents of Tim Mendees. Yeah.
But yeah, we've got 4 anthologies out now, and planning the next one. So that's been cool. That's been going strong. Yeah. So yes, that's basically me and how I got into. I'll tell a little story about my first Clark Ashton Smith book a little bit later, perhaps.
Yeah.
But how about you? Were you the sort of same age when you got into all this stuff?
Yeah, I was. I got into it really early because I was always a weird kid anyway. And I was always a bit of a bookworm, like from a very early age. And again, I did the usual things of reading Tolkien and, you know, I never got through the Silmarillion though. That just baked my head. I couldn't cope with that one.
Yeah.
But my gran used to pick up paperbacks and things like that from the markets and stuff like that. We always used to go to the Saturday market, and I'd be there rummaging through the paperbacks.
Nice.
And I actually got into weird fiction through the Willows, Blackwood, because it was in like some collect, because my grandparents got all the Reader's Digest.
Oh yeah,
stuff.
yeah. I remember
So you had like
those, yeah.
great tales of the supernatural and all this kind of stuff, and I got into it through that, and through that I found like Lovecraft and stuff like that, and in turn through Lovecraft I found Clark Ashton Smith. It was actually from the Tales of the Cthulhu Mythos.
Oh right.
I think it was the Del Rey reprint.
Yeah.
The paperback, and through that, because there was a couple of his tales in there. There's Return of the Sorcerer and Ubbo Sattler, I think.
Ubbo Sattler.
Yeah. And through that, then I picked up the Panther paperbacks, The Lost World, Volume 1 and 2, which I actually dug out the other day because I've still got them. Yeah. And I kind of felt it was actually Tale of Samtatra's
Satamprazeros.
The Tamprazeros. Yeah, it was that I fell in love with. Yeah. And from there, I was kind of hooked. And yeah, then I became a chef from leaving school. So I didn't really do any writing or much reading either for a number of years, just because when you're a chef and you're also like in bands and I'm a DJ as well, there wasn't a lot of downtime.
Sure.
But then once I got back into reading heavily, sort of in my mid-30s, and one of the first things I did was picked up the Clark Ashton Smith, because they just brought out the Penguin Classics, the Dark Eidolon.
Right. Oh yeah.
Yeah, I picked it up for it. I found it. I just spotted it. I was just like, I need a new book. I haven't got a book. So I went in Waterstones and it was there, and I picked it up and it was like, oh. And it all just came flooding back. So that was kind of, yeah. And that's when I kind of started writing just after that, like a few years after that, when I got injured and my career kind of over. It was like all them books I've had in my head for decades, but I've never had the time to do it. I suddenly didn't have an excuse anymore. It's like, right, you're not going to be working for the foreseeable future. You've got no excuse. Get writing. So
kind of mirrors Smith a little bit, doesn't it? Which I'm sure
we'll
talk about.
Yeah, it does. Yeah. So that's kind of how it happened with me, and it was just basically for the sake of my sanity, because I needed something to do, and it's just sort of gone from there. And
you've got quite a number of short stories and novellas and stuff out as well now.
Yeah,
so
I've got
very prolific.
Yeah, I've got my seven sort of novelettes, and I think just about 100 short stories out there.
Wow, that's good. That's it. Once I started writing, all these ideas that I've had just come pouring out.
Pouring out. Yeah. I've got notebooks full of all these ideas going back decades. So, it's just like I'm never short of an idea.
Yes, I know that. It's the notepad at all times. There's always a notepad within reach.
Exactly. This is it. Yeah, I have them strategically placed around my flat. So I have one in every room, just in case.
Just in case. The muse strikes.
The muse strikes when you're sitting on the lavvy or something at 3 a.m. Because it's never at a sensible time, is it? No, it's always at a stupid time. Yeah.
The strangest one I had was I woke up in the middle of the night from an excellent dream and wrote something on my notepad and went back to sleep. Woke up, couldn't remember the dream at all, but on the notepad I'd written 300 horses. And to this day, I don't know. It could have been a lost classic, couldn't it? It could have been an absolute fantastic story, but we'll never know. So
yeah. Oh, some of the things, it's like you wake up and you look at your notepad and go, "What the hell does that even mean?" It's just gibberish. Yeah.
I like what you said about the going through the books and the market and that kind of thing as well. So I think we both lived through that. Certainly the 70s and the 80s. Or we had the surge of the paperback. And all the reprints.
Yeah, and they used to just get like old crisp boxes full of them at the local markets, and obviously the booksellers as well, because that was the sort of disposable you'd have all the hardbacks on the shelves, and then the local bookshop. Then you just have like old crisp boxes and things like that, just stuffed with paperbacks.
It was great. There was like a second-hand bookshop in every town, wasn't it? Every high street.
Oh God, yeah.
And
at least one.
Yeah. The one we had in Ilford, it was quite funny because I know we've spoken about this before in relation to Innsmouth, which we'll mention later. Was you had all the proper books at the front. Then the further you went in, you got to the sci-fi and horror, and you had the nudie mags at the back.
The nudie mags at the back, yeah.
It's kind of, you know.
Well, that's Ramsey Campbell's cold print, isn't it?
Totally.
Oh, there was always a back room. Yeah, the bookshop we frequented in Macclesfield. As kids, we used to like, quick, he's not looking.
So that was, I'm pretty sure it was in one of those shops that I bought up. I got this book. This was the first Clark Ashton Smith I read, and it's one of those Panther editions from 1974. Yeah. Genius Loci and Other Tales.
Well, I've got the two Panther Lost Worlds.
The Lost Worlds, yeah.
Yeah, I used to have the Lynn Carter edited Hyperborea one as well, but God knows where that is.
Oh, right. I've got a couple more. I've got the Abominations of Yondo and a couple of others.
Oh, nice.
And I just love these old paperbacks with the sort of yellowed pages and everything else. There's something very evocative about it.
Yeah, I do.
And I think what caught my eye on this were the two things were the Bruce Pennington artwork on the front, which is fantastic, the winged demon in this case.
Yes.
And then, of course, on the back, you've got the quote, "None strikes the note of cosmic horror as well as Clark Ashton Smith. In sheer demonic strangeness and fertility of conception, Smith is perhaps unexcelled by any other writer, dead or living, H.P. Lovecraft." And it's hard to argue with that statement, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. That's interesting because it's got the same quote on both of these. And then under it, it's got a Ray Bradbury quote. And then the differences on the two volumes of Lost Worlds is that volume 1 has got an L. Sprague de Camp quote, and volume 2 has got a Fritz Leiber quote.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So that's always quite interesting. So, yeah, when you pick them up, the first thing you see is these guys, Lovecraft, Bradbury, Leiber, de Camp. It's like, right, okay, well,
you've got to check that out.
Got to give it a whirl, haven't you?
Yeah. And I remember I bought this. My family were going on holiday. We actually went to a caravan site because that's kind of where we used to go.
Oh, God. Well, of course, we all did, didn't we?
And I actually looked it up, this place. It's All Hallows Holiday Park. And it's on the south bank of the Thames estuary, sort of opposite Canvey Island.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And so it said there was a local beach. Well, the beach is basically like mud flats.
Mud bank.
Yeah. But it was quite strange because it was a very atmospheric place, very desolate. I mean, even though you're just outside London, it's one of those places, I guess we're talking like with the east coast of England kind of atmosphere. Way out.
M.R. James country.
Yeah, totally. And, of course, the first story in this book is Genius Loci, which is about this strange haunted location.
Yeah.
And something just clicked with me of being in this place and reading that story. And, that was it.
Yeah. There's a time when I was living down in Devon in a Budleigh Salterton, which is a kind of strange little place. And I read Shadow over Innsmouth and it just resonated.
It's nice, isn't it? You almost get a feeling of like you're in the story. You know?
Yeah. Exactly.
And I think that's the power of both those authors as well.
Yes.
They bring that real world to life. It's difficult to distinguish between the real world and the fictional world in some ways.
Yeah. Smith stuff especially is so evocative. I mean, I'm sure that's something we'll be talking about a lot. His imagery is just second to none. It's just,
So that's a little bit about us. I'll expect you'll discover more of our foibles as we go along. I think we should add at the start that neither of us would consider ourselves scholars.
No.
Right? We're definitely fans. We know some things. We've got some opinions, of course.
Yeah.
But we're by no means scholars. And we welcome any corrections or suggestions or questions that people send in. So if we do slip up, I think the pronunciations is going to be one area. And we do have our dictionaries to hand as well. Because
we've got to have Clark Ashton Smith Dictionary Corner.
I think we'll probably do, should we do like a favourite word each episode? That might be
that's a great idea. I think we should do that, We'll
bring that in.
Yeah, because he's one of them authors that makes you feel stupid.
Again, that notepad by the bed thing, there's, every page there's a couple of words go down on that. But it's good from a writer's point of view to expand your vocabulary.
Oh, damn right, yeah. It's like, I think I said to you the other day when we were talking about it, it was like, if I can get like a fraction of Clark Ashton Smith's grasp on the English language, then I'll be happy.
Well, that was always my feeling with Smith was, so I've got, I think we're up to 6 volumes now, my Wolf Sword and Sorcery saga, which is very much like the tribute band Robert E. Howard kind of thing. It's my attempt at writing in a Howardian way.
Yes.
Which some people have been very kind and said, yeah, it's sort of getting there, you know.
Yeah.
I think we both write Lovecraftian, right, or certain aspects of Lovecraft anyway. I mean, you very successfully with a lot of the stories, particularly those Cornwall ones. They're very very atmospheric. But I don't feel I can get anywhere near writing the way Smith does.
No,
it's just way outside of my skill level.
Yeah, it's like reading the Ramsey Campbell introduction to the first volume. He says that it's the kind of thing, you know. It's just like the only person he thought of the original circle that got close to Smith's was Fritz Leibers, which I would probably go along with.
Yeah. I can see that.
Yeah.
And then certainly later on, he wasn't part of that circle, but the only other guy who comes close is Jack Vance.
Yes.
I guess, which kind of then leads us into Michael Shea as well, right?
It does,
a direct line there.
Yeah, which actually Shea was heavily inspired by Clark Ashton Smith. I mean, he wrote several stories involving the old sleepy toad god, didn't he?
Oh, yes.
Yes. My personal favourite mythos deity. I love that guy.
This show is sponsored by Sarthogua.
Yeah.
So any complaints, then let him, her, it, they know.
Yeah.
So you mentioned the volumes there. This is what we're using as our guide, is the excellent Nightshade collection. They've got 5 volumes out of all of Smith's stories. I think, as you said, there's about 100, which he wrote over 4 years, which is just mind-blowing as well.
It's impressive. Yeah.
They're a great series. We highly recommend getting these if you haven't got them already, because they collect all of his original stories in chronological order, and they've got the original manuscripts in some cases as well.
Yes, like many of the Weird Tales authors of the time, Smith's work was heavily edited and revised, sometimes like to a ridiculous length. Farnsworth Wright used to like getting his shears out, didn't he?
Yes.
So, and like many of his contemporaries, he was often skint. You know, he had no money, so he had little option to go along with what Farnsworth Wright said and other editors of the time, just to get a bit of cash. You know, which is a shame, really.
Yeah.
But that's great about these editions is the editors at Nightshade Books have done like some painstaking work, haven't they? Presenting the unexpurgated Clark Ashton Smith.
Yes.
They got the original manuscripts, like holographs and all that kind of business, haven't they? And
yeah,
it's quite impressive.
It is. It's incredible work. It's Scott Connors and Ron Hilger. Is that Hilger or Hilger? I guess Hilger. And I know they access the John Hay Library a lot, and they've really put the time in to track down as many of the original texts as they can.
Yeah, they got some stuff. There's a thank you to S.T. Joshi as well, isn't there? Because he had some pieces from because he did a collection a while ago, didn't he?
Yes,
of Clark
Ashton like an
Smith.
annotated collection, I think. Was it?
Yeah, that was it. And so they've got his like notes and things like that. So they've pulled it from all these kind of different disparate sources, which is really quite impressive.
I mean, they were tracking down people that Smith sent manuscripts to and things and all sorts of stuff. So yeah. Because again, with the Panther editions, you're never quite sure what version of the story you're getting or anything. Same with the Lovecraft, right? And the Howard as well. I mean, Howard was butchered, of course, by well, that's another issue, perhaps. On the one hand, it gets the material out there, but on the other hand, you're not seeing the full richness of the work.
Yes.
The nice thing with the Nightshade books is they give a short commentary at the back on each as well. Sometimes with Smith talking about the story from his perspective, which is very nice as well. So yes, that's the corpus we will be working from. And it's nicely organised for us. It sort of cuts down on our work, doesn't it? Because
yeah, it's like all the research is done. I'm finding them really interesting though, like reading these, like the commentary bits and like the notes and all this kind of. Because it's like I noticed in one of the stories in this volume, which we will get round to at some point, that there's the original, an alternative ending, like you get on DVDs.
Yes, yeah.
Isn't there? That'll be interesting. We'll have to cover both endings when we do it and things like that.
Yeah, it's nice because obviously with 5 volumes, we're going to do 1 season per volume.
Mm-hmm.
Now, some of the stories are obviously very short and some are a little bit longer. So the longer stories we'll devote a whole episode, maybe 2 episodes to. And with some of the shorter stories, they're only a few pages long. We'll cover maybe 2 or 3 of them in one episode.
Yeah, some of them are really short, aren't they? And as we've got an hour to fill, it probably makes sense to pair some of them up. It won't just be us either. We're going to get in some guests, aren't we? And things like that. Because we've had a few people who are kind of interested and, maybe get people in to discuss their favourite ones, their fellow fans, scholars and the like.
Yes, and I'm sure we'll also talk about... There's not been a huge amount of adaptations. There's been more TV adaptations, perhaps, than movie adaptations.
From what I've discovered, there has been a grand total of 3. One of which is a short, which I'm having difficulty tracking down, of The Last Incantation from, 2019. I think it was, a student film.
Ah, right.
The most recent was actually in an anthology film called The Theatre Bazaar.
Oh, I've not seen that.
And they did a segment, Mother of Toads.
Oh, nice.
Which it's a good one. And the other one was the classic Ron Serling's Night Gallery.
Yes.
They did Return of the Sorcerer. Yeah. And that's basically it.
Was it Boris Karloff in that, or am I getting it confused with something else?
Vincent Price.
Oh, Vincent Price. Right.
It was Vincent Price. Yeah. And there was also a documentary about Clark Ashton Smith's life, about his work and life, called Clark Ashton Smith, Emperor of Dreams, from 2018.
Yes. Yeah. Highly recommended again.
Yeah.
It is really good, and we'll certainly be dipping into that for some reference as well. And the other thing I wanted to mention, our other source, is Stephen Barron's 2013 biography.
Ah, yes.
Which is an excellent read. So it's part biography and then part going through Smith's different settings and how he approached them. That's a great read. We'd like to dip into his letters as well, but I was going to ask our listeners, actually, can anyone recommend the best collection of Clark Ashton Smith letters? Because there's quite a few out there.
Yes.
And you get this strange situation on Amazon where it says, Smith's letters to Lovecraft, £65.
Oh, God, yeah. Yeah, it's ridiculous, isn't it? It's, yeah.
And then you might read it's got like a 2-star review or something, So if anyone does have any recommendations, we do hope that there's going to be more scholarly work on Smith. I'm sure there has been more going on over the past few years.
Yeah.
So perhaps as that develops, we'll get more sort of books or letters coming.
Yeah, I'm hoping they do what I can't remember the publisher did with Fritz Leiber. They brought out his Lovecraftian stories in a nice big paperback, along with his letters to Lovecraft.
Oh, that's nice.
And it's called Leiber and Lovecraft, Writers of the Dark.
Oh.
And it's a superb volume. It is a great volume. It's got all of his classic Lovecraftian stories in it. It's it's well worth picking up. I'm hoping they'll do that.
Yeah, and speaking of collections, there's the Michael Shea one out, wasn't there, fairly recently?
Yes.
I believe his wife put out, his widow, of all his mythos stories.
Yeah, Demiurge.
That's it, Demiurge.
Yeah, I've got that as well. That's another good one. Yeah, it's another very good one.
So, yeah, if anyone can recommend any good collection of Smith letters, then we'd be very pleased to hear that as well. And we'll be mixing that kind of thing in along with talking about the stories. We were originally thinking about when the story is set at a particular point in Smith's life, then perhaps we could talk about what was going on. But as he wrote 100 stories in 4 years...
Yeah, we'd have to be very specific, wouldn't we? Yeah. On the 10th of June...
He woke up at 8 o'clock, had
Yeah.
coffee for breakfast.
Oh, the postman brought him a letter.
Yeah. He lived way beyond his output of fiction. So maybe that's the next thing we'll talk about then. Let's just give a little sort of biography of Smith. As I say, we won't go too much into detail here because we'll add in more as we get through the stories.
Yeah.
So he was born January the 13th, 1893 in Long Valley, California. His father was English and his mother was from New England, I understand. And he spent most of his life in California in the town of Auburn, which, from what I gather, is sort of cattle country.
Yeah. Onion farms and things like that as well, isn't it? It's
so not exactly a sort of thriving metropolis.
No.
He said he always hated the provincialism of the place, but he
but never moved.
Rarely left it. Yeah, I think he travelled even less than, we get back to this thing of Lovecraft the Hermit again. Yeah, Lovecraft was popping up all over the place.
No, he actually travelled a lot more than people think, but Smith never really did. The same with Robert E. Howard, wasn't it? He basically, he stayed in Texas. That was pretty much it.
Popped down to Mexico a couple of times, and
that was pretty much it.
Isn't it? Yeah. So Smith seemed to be quite a gifted child. He was a very early reader, and some say that he had an eidetic memory, so he retained whatever he read. He was quite sickly as a child as well. He suffered from agoraphobia. So he stayed at home and pretty much was self-educated.
The eidetic memory would probably explain where a lot of these weird words that we've never heard of before come from. Probably read a dictionary once and just retained it.
I did read somewhere that he did do that. He did sat down and read through the dictionary,
Well, if you're self-educated, you're going to take everything you can get, aren't you, really? I mean,
And he was very much into Arabian Nights and Poe. I mean, we can see obvious influences there later.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, here it is. He read the entire unabridged 13th edition of Webster's Dictionary, word for word, studying not only the definitions of the words, but also their etymology.
Nice.
So that I like that because it's not just using a word for effect. I learnt this big word, I'm going to drop it. But he understands the background of it and the substance of it.
Yeah.
Very much like Tolkien in that respect.
Yes. Yeah.
Now, something that people don't always know about Smith is he had success very early on. I think he was 19.
Yeah. Well, I wasn't aware of that until reading up on him more. Because there was such a big gap between his works, wasn't there?
Yeah. He actually started as a poet. He was sort of mentored by George Sterling. And at the age of 19, he had a volume of poems published called The Star Treader and Other Poems, which got huge acclaim. Someone called him the Keats of the Pacific.
Nice.
And that saw him rubbing shoulders with the likes of Ambrose Bierce and Jack London. So to come from that sort of nowhere, really, into those sort of circles, virtually overnight.
Yeah, well, that's what Leiber's Our Lady of Darkness touches on. That's that San Francisco scene of Smith, Bierce, Vance, and all them guys. So, yeah, he was part of that kind of circle, wasn't he?
Yeah. But it didn't last, unfortunately, because, again, this problem with his health. So for the next 8 years, he wasn't particularly writing or working very much, though he did put some poetry out.
Yeah.
And at that time, he came into contact with other figures who would later be part of the Lovecraft circle. And one person described this. So you have people like Samuel Loveman and George Kirk, Donald Wandre.
Yep.
And some people have even said it wasn't so much Smith joining the Lovecraft circle as Lovecraft joining the Smith circle, which is interesting. You don't think of it in those terms.
No. Yeah, because it wasn't Lovecraft who actually got him back into writing again properly.
Yes. Lovecraft wrote him a letter, I believe, after reading one of his poems called The Hashish Eater.
Oh, yes.
And that's what started their friendship of... Basically, Smith was doing all sorts of jobs to try to make ends meet. He was working in fields, he was digging stuff, he was fruit picking and that kind of thing. And it was, apparently there was two things. One was Lovecraft encouraged him to get back into writing.
Yeah.
But also, 1929, the Depression started and his parents were both quite ill, so he had to look after them.
Yeah.
And apparently his girlfriend said to him, get off your ass, start writing and make some money.
Yeah.
Which, behind every great man.
Yes, yeah, there you go. Yeah, there you go. Yeah, because it was Lovecraft's prompting that to send stuff to Weird Tales and Outstanding Stories and all these kind of the pulps, basically, wasn't it? It was basically like, Farnsworth, go on, send something to Farnsworth.
Yeah. So, that prompted this between 1929 and 1934. He put out over 100 short stories.
Yeah. I was reading that he was probably the most prolific Weird Tales writer, wasn't he? Of that, in terms of how many were published in Weird Tales.
Oh, right.
Yeah, it's in the the Ramsey Campbell introduction here.
Because Lovecraft, I'm trying to think how many stories Lovecraft wrote off the top of my head. It certainly wasn't, I don't think he reached 100, did he?
No.
Robert E. Howard maybe was getting there because he wrote 20-odd Conan stories, and then you have all the Solomon Kane and Brown McMahon.
Yeah, it was basically it was Smith, then Howard,
right,
then Derleth, in terms of out of the circle who was most prolific in terms of Weird Tales.
Yeah.
So it was Smith, Howard, then Derleth. Yeah, which makes sense really because Derleth churned them out, and so did Howard and that.
Yeah. And it's quite surprising in a way about Smith because again, when we get into the stories and we see what Farnsworth Wright said about a lot of them, he seems to have rejected a lot of them on the grounds they're too clever.
Yeah, and again, they took the shears to them as well. It's just like.
It's like having a Sharpie pen and the Mona Lisa, isn't it? I just need to shade this in a bit more. Or,
yeah, exactly.
Or the Mozart thing, too many notes,
Too many notes, yeah. You could lose a couple of semitones there. It doesn't make sense to me. It really doesn't. It's like you've got this guy who's undoubtedly a genius when it comes to because I mean, a lot of his stuff, even though it isn't prose poetry, it could be.
Yeah.
There's a rhythm to it, and the language he uses, it is very poetic and it is very vivid. So why you suddenly go, you know what, we'll take this really descriptive passage out and just put he died.
Yeah. and then a hell beast ate them.
Yeah, it's like the opposite of polishing a turd, isn't it? Yeah. It's like taking a diamond and rubbing it in crap.
And it must have been particularly annoying if he was into his words and his etymology. Again, it'd be like the Tolkien thing. No, that word has a specific resonance in that phrase. It's all finely structured. I always think of it, they're like finely crafted and created.
Yes.
Even the short stories, the little vignette, it's very finely crafted.
Well, that's what I found really impressive, like considering like how prolific he was in the 4 years. Like, how detailed his stories are and how deep they are. And like you say, even the vignettes and even just the poems, it's obviously he didn't just, maybe he did, maybe they did just come out like that. But his process involved 4 drafts, I believe, that he would write the first draft out longhand, and then the next thing he'd type them up like 3 or 4 times before he was happy with it.
Yes, and I think what we'll do is, as we go through some of the stories, perhaps we can look at his process. It's quite well detailed in a couple of places, isn't it?
Yes.
I think Ramsey Campbell talks about it, and Steve Behrens talks about it in that book as well. So
yeah, there's also some really interesting things about specific Clark Ashton Smith stuff in the Chaosium Cycle books.
Oh, right.
Like the Sathogua Cycle and the Book of Ebon and the Clark Ashton Cycle. Robert M. Price goes into some really good detail about the various parts of his mythos and his stuff. And there's some interesting like curios in there, like a letter he wrote about the mythos and the family tree that Clark Ashton Smith did. It's in the Book of Ebon. And it's really interesting. It's tongue in cheek, because it was just something he wrote like to his mates, so they're all in there. You've got HPL, the Atlantean scholar HPL, and Mr. Chime Sleepius and Yeah, yeah.
James Lee Hughes,
Two Gun
yeah.
Bob, you know, the Comte de Erlet, they're all in there.
And it was. I mean, this is something we've talked about before on our other podcasts. By the way, I don't think we mentioned at the start that we also host, along with John Chadwick, the Innsmouth Book Club podcast.
Indeed.
And that's partly how this podcast came about, because I know you've had the Nightwish volumes for a while. I got them as well recently. And obviously with the Innsmouth Book Club podcast, we're looking at a wide range of Lovecraftian authors and weird fiction.
Yeah.
And I started reading Clark Ashton Smith again. I thought, we need to cover that one, and we need to cover that one, and we need to cover that one. So then we sort of thought, well, let's just do all these stories. And I have to give a shout out here to the Appendix N podcast as well, Jeff and Hoy, who covered the first volume in this just recently. But we'll put a link into those guys in the show notes below.
Oh,
and that's kind of what piqued my interest again.
Oh, excellent.
And in fact, I think hopefully Jeff and Hoy, or Jeff or Hoy, are going to be coming on as guests at some time.
Nice.
So yes, these 100 stories, and that was pretty much it for his fiction output. There wasn't a great deal after that. He had a sort of rough time in the mid to late 30s. His parents died, Lovecraft died, Bob Howard died. It must have been a very depressing time. And I guess it started to see the decline of weird tales and perhaps that whole market as well, especially when we got into the war years.
Yes. Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, it was just a period of complete, upheaval for him, really, wasn't it? It's all his mates are dying, his family's dying, and like you've touched on before, I mean, he'd had all these health problems and obviously the agoraphobia and things like that. Anytime anything like that happens, because you know what grief's like, it can knock you sideways at the best of times, and if you're already predisposed to depression, things like that, it can just floor you. It can just completely floor you.
Totally, and obviously his financial situation suffered as a result.
Yep.
Though one thing I have taken from reading about him is, how can I put this delicately? He seemed to be having quite a good time.
Yes.
And this is something he mentions in his letters, which again we'll get into. Sometimes in fairly graphic detail, or graphic poetic detail. In any event, he had a lot of friends amongst the local housewives.
Yes.
And,
yes.
And people. So. And that's something that's reflected in his work, because out of the three, he's the most sexy author. Right?
Oh yeah, he was the sexy author of the Lovecraft circle, wasn't he? You know, there was.
Yeah.
I mean, even in Abominations of Yondo, there's a passage, isn't there, about right there, right from the beginning. There's a bit about curves and. Oh, I had an eye for the ladies, did you, sir?
I mean, Lovecraft was totally unsexual or asexual in his writings. Obviously, there's speculation about it in his life.
Yeah.
But certainly in his writings, there's even very few female characters. And the main one I can think of was Asenath Waite, who was kind of a man as well. So, you know. Yeah,
that was a strange one, wasn't it? That was an interesting one. That.
And then other than Lavinia Waitley, I can't really think of anyone else.
Unless you could count Keziah.
Oh, yes, that's true. Yeah, and Rob Howard obviously is full of heaving bosoms and
yes, no shortage of heaving bosoms in Robert Howard
and steely thews. I mean, across the board, right? We've got steely thews and heaving bosoms, and
nice.
But Smith is more subtle than that.
Yeah,
and sometimes, again, rereading some of these stories, I picked up a lot of things that I perhaps hadn't noticed first time. And it was interesting, I saw an interview with someone, it might have been in the Emperor of Dreams films, and he said he actually appreciates Smith now more in his 50s than when he first read them as a teenager.
I do.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I went back to it after all that time that I said, because I'd read them when I was younger, and then going back to them, I appreciated them a lot more. Because at the time when I first read them, I kind of thought they were good, and I enjoyed them, but I thought it was a bit purple and a bit flowery, because my taste was a lot more not refined, I guess. It's just but now I really appreciate the poetic language and all that kind of business, you know.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think Well, again, you can come to literature or any art form with different expectation, right? So,
Oh yeah,
if you're watching
yeah.
a slasher movie, you're not expecting The Godfather, are you? You know,
Yes, this is it.
It's that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I know we've spoken about this before on the Innsmouth Book Club about some stories. Well, particularly August Derleth, we were talking about. I can read those as good Call of Cthulhu adventures.
Yeah, yeah.
But they're not particularly cosmic. They don't leave me with a sense of dread or fear.
Yeah.
But they're entertaining.
Yes, yeah, yeah. They're just a different beast. I mean, and I guess at that time when I was younger, I was more into the Derleth style. I mean, I was heavily into Robert Bloch,
Right.
which is a more visceral action. It's almost cinematic as opposed to the poetic. And I guess that's the difference between, like, you know, your Robert E. Howards and your Robert Blochs and your Clark Ashton Smith.
Yeah.
I guess that's the difference.
And I think it is now. I find it's incredibly rich. In fact, so rich, I find I can only perhaps read one or two stories at a time. It's almost like eating a fine meal. This isn't fast food, is it? You know?
No, it's really not.
It's gourmet. Not. It's gourmet night.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, funnily enough, in the introduction from Ramsey Campbell, the final lines here is, "Don't go too fast through this treasure house or the light may desert you. Take your time to savor the imagination and the language. It has aged like Atlantean wine."
Oh, that's nice.
You always count on Ramsey Campbell for a good line, can't you?
Absolutely.
And he's right. You know, they are stories to take your time over. You can't just rush through them. You know? You savor them. Yeah.
Wow. So yes, that was largely his output of fiction. He sort of turned to sculpture and painting, and poetry. Of course, he returned to as well in later life. I suppose the good thing was he saw like the release of his work in Arkham House and everything. I think 1960 was The Abominations of Yondo and other stories, and a lot of his poetry got published as well. So he did at least have that satisfaction, which of course was denied Lovecraft and Howard.
Yeah, yeah.
And he passed away in 1961, aged 68, and his ashes were buried beside a boulder just to the immediate west of his childhood home. And some were also scattered in a nearby stand of blue oaks. No marker, no monument, nothing.
No fuss.
Though since plaques recognising Smith have been erected at Auburn Place County Library and the Bicentennial Park in Auburn as well.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah, his hometown did come to sort of recognise him.
That's good. Yeah. You know, you don't like to think that he's been completely sort of ignored, you know.
Now, we're going to put most of our episodes out for free. They'll be going up on Buzzsprout, is going to be our main platform, and also our YouTube channel as well. But if you'd like to access bonus content and to support the show, we're also going to offer a Patreon subscription as well. That comes in at 3 levels. At the lowest level, you get access to bonus content and also a monthly PDF of Innsmouth News, which contains some articles and author spotlights and that kind of thing. And because we're sort of doing this as an offshoot of the Innsmouth Book Club podcast, if you support Strange Shadows, you also get access to the Innsmouth Book Club bonus content as well.
Nice. Yeah, and at the mid-level, you will also get a discount on merch and access to chat and video sessions.
Yep, and if you join us at the top level, you get an exclusive T-shirt, and you also get the chance to join us on the show. So that's what we're covering. That's who we're covering. That's who we are and how we're covering it. I think one thing, again, as we'll get into it, we'll talk about Smith settings of Averoigne and Zothique and Mars and all the rest of it. And we look forward to exploring those locations with you, dear listener.
Very much so, yeah. It's like I say, my personal favourite is the Hyperborea stuff. I love all that. Just anything that involves the old toad.
You're just an old toad man, aren't you?
I'm an old toad man myself, yeah. And
we're very keen to hear your views as well. So please do post in your comments, questions and suggestions to us at innsmouthbookclub@outlook.com. And we'll also put links up below to our Facebook and YouTube pages, our Patreon site, and our Buzzsprout site as well. So that's it for our first episode. Our second will be out in a fortnight's time. when we're covering Smith's very first story, The Abominations of Yondo.
Oh, yes. That's going to be fun. I'm looking forward to that one.
So we do hope you can join us for that. In the meantime, do get in touch. Do check our Patreon site. And we're going to leave you today with the full reading of To a Demon. So, until next time, it's goodbye from me, Rob Poyton.
And it's goodbye from me, Tim Mendees.
Tell me many tales, O benign maleficent demon, but tell me none that I have ever heard or have even dreamt of, otherwise than obscurely or infrequently. Nay, tell me not of anything that lies between the bournes of time or the limits of space, for I am a little weary of all recorded years and charted lands, and the isles that are westward of Cathay and the sunset realms of Ind are not remote enough to be made the abiding place of my conceptions, and Atlantis is over new for my thoughts to sojourn there, and Mu itself has gazed upon the sun in aeons that are too recent. Tell me many tales, but let them be of things that are past the law of legend, and of which there are no myths in our world, or any world adjoining. Tell me, if you will, of the years when the moon was young, with siren-rippled seas and mountains that were zoned with flowers from base to summit. Tell me of the planets grey with eld, of the worlds whereon no mortal astronomer has ever looked, and whose mystic heavens and horizons have given pause to visionaries. Tell me of the vaster blossoms within whose cradling chalices a woman could sleep, of the seas of fire that beat on strands of ever-during ice, of perfumes that can give eternal slumber in a breath, of eyeless titans that dwell on Uranus, and beings that wander in the green light of the twin suns of azure and orange. Tell me tales of inconceivable fear and unimaginable love, in orbs whereto our sun is a nameless star, and unto which its rays have never reached.
You have been listening to Strange Shadows, an Innsmouth Gold production in association with the Innsmouth Book Club. For more information, visit www.innsmouthgold.com, because Innsmouth is not just a place, it's a state of mind.